Hey everybody, I am here with MAME developer David, and I gotta open up by thanking you and everybody that has ever worked on MAME for making such an awesome piece of freaking software that I love so much. So thank
Mm,
you for joining us today.
I, I mean, you're welcome. It's always good to be able to talk to people about the work we've done. And so I've been doing it for practically, over 20 years. I think I started doing it about 1999 now.
Oh wow.
And that's when I was getting into it and then doing a little bit more. And over the years, I've done more. And there's slightly less these days because the challenges are bigger and they take longer and everything else. But yeah, it's just something I enjoy doing. And it's been probably an important part of my life, I'd say, really. So I'm always glad to hear when people appreciate what's been done and enjoy it and discover things from it, learn things from it. And I'm glad to be able to, help take arcade games, computer games, everything else to the next generations. Really, make sure that these things aren't left behind in time. So, I'm glad to be here. So, if there's anything you want to ask, any questions you want to fire off, then
Oh,
that's why I'm here. So,
there's quite a few. There's quite a few. So I think everybody that's listening to this is into the preservation and the experiencing of all of these awesome old games and some of the not so awesome old ones, because those offer a fun
yeah,
perspective sometimes too. I know you do some
yeah,
streams, you do some terrible game
mm,
streams sometimes, but I guess to start
yeah.
from the beginning, for anybody that's heard the name but doesn't really understand what it is, maybe they're younger and just getting into this, MAME is the multi arcade machine emulator, right? I didn't forget the name
Yeah,
of it.
and originally that was the name. I mean, these days we just refer to it as MAME. We kind of dropped the multi-arcade machine part because we emulate all sorts of things now. I mean, everything from arcade machines, computers, calculators. Did a lot of Game and Watch work recently, so it's not really arcade as such anymore. I know a lot of people still know it by that acronym, but we officially just use MAME these days. But yeah, it started off, say, as an arcade emulator. It started off as an evolution of Nicola's multipack, which was just a Pac-Man emulator that emulated multiple games on Pac-Man hardware. It got merged into other things and eventually became MAME in about '97, and it's just grown from there. We've done, say, arcade games for most of the life, and then so for the last 5 or 6 years, we integrated the MES project, which was multi-emulator super system, which was always looking at the home systems, the consoles, and that kind of made sense because a lot of the arcade systems were also based on the console tech. A lot of the home tech also pushed the chips with emulating much harder than the arcade, so it allowed us to improve the arcade emulation. But yeah, it's a project that is always evolving, always trying to preserve new things, and always looking for ways to improve. Really, I mean, ways we can better ourselves, working with external people and internal people. So yeah, say a lot of it's been external people recently contributing. The Capsoft guys who have been doing the chip decapping, for example.
Yeah.
We couldn't, as programmers, we couldn't possibly do that ourselves, but they've allowed us to have access to the code inside these protection chips and improve the emulator. So, it's a big project, but basically the scope is anything these days. Anything that can be dumped and emulated and ran, we'll have a stab at it. As long as there's somebody interested, external, internal to the team, it's a valid thing to have a look at, I would say. So does
Yeah.
that explain it? I don't know.
That's got to be one of those projects where if anybody ever knew the scope that it would cover from the
Mm.
beginning, you probably wouldn't have started it, because it's like, we're never going to get to all that stuff. That would take 20
Yeah,
years. And here
yeah,
you are. So
that is the thing. And now we're thinking, well, in another 20 years, what are we going to have done then? Because
right.
we just don't know at this point. But yeah, there's a lot of things that even in terms of my work, I've thought I'll never be the one to look at that. That's never going to be the work I'm going to be doing in the project. And then 5, 10 years later, it's like I'm doing this work in the project. I'm now doing this thing, and it does work. It is like that. Yeah, I don't think anybody back '97 would have thought it'll be doing the things we're doing now. Say the Game and Watch things or anything like that. So.
And,
I mean, I
and
hope everybody's really
97 was
involved.
when the name first started to get out on the scene, right?
Yeah, that was sort of the first. I think the first official zero point 0.1 release was February '97, around then, and obviously there was a lot of buzz about the project at that time because people had only seen really bad ports of arcade games up until that point for the most part, and there were some okay ones on the things like the Saturn, but then you've got an emulator on the PC running all these things in original form.
Hmm.
The emulation wasn't actually very good back then, but at the time it was sort of, wow, this is possible. You can run the original code. and it plays pretty much like you'd expect, looks like you'd expect, and obviously that created a big buzz. And there were a lot more emulators back then. There were, we had MAME. There was others like Rain and I think it was it Sparkade and Rage, Neo Rage X, the Neo Geo one. There were loads more back then doing this kind of thing, but sort of MAME is the one that's outlasted them all, really. There are still some others around that do arcade.
Yeah.
Final Burn Neo now is still doing some arcade stuff of their own, also doing non-arcade stuff. But yeah, you wouldn't. I wouldn't have thought that any of what was being done now was going to be done when I started back on it. I mean, back then I was printing off the source, because you could print off bits of the source code and have a good amount of print offs just to study offline. And these days you'd print off, you'd have a sort of stack of papers about this high,
right,
and books full of it to try and do it. But I mean, I'm glad to see how it's evolved, because at the times when the scope did annoy me. I mean, if you look at the history of the project when it was split between MAME and MES, I was putting out these the builds called UME, Universal Machine Emulator, which combined the two back then. And that was based on when I was trying to emulate the Mega Drive hardware for the Sega C2 board. And my test cases were more the Mega Drive games, but I had to cut that out the project for the MAME stuff. And it never sat quite right with me, because my test cases weren't the stuff that was going into the project. And eventually, they did become the one project.
Do you remember about the year that you were releasing the combined version like that?
It was probably about, what? I mean, I think the official merge was about 5-6 years ago now, so it would have been a couple of years before that. So
it's funny. I think that's what I was. It's hilarious and awesome to me that so many of the people that I get to talk to when I do these interviews are people that I've interacted with for a long time. And I'm wondering if you and I have ever talked before this, because I definitely used that. I had a Mortal Kombat arcade machine that I built a PC into and made it, a multi-system emulator. But I wanted to also include Atari 2600, just because the joystick I thought would translate well on an arcade machine, which it did. So I'm pretty sure that's one of the things that I integrated in there as one of the testing. So
it was briefly Ultimate MAME, then it was UME, but that was only ever meant to be a temporary thing. But it's entirely possible. There's a lot of people I'll talk to, and it's I remember reading this update from back in the day. I remember when you did the CPS3 emulation, back when. And it's like, I mean, to me that was a rather low point in time, because you do something that popular, you get a lot of people harassing you about it, and just it's like I don't want this level of constant nagging about this bug, that bug, everything else. I've done my best at the time, but yeah, I do find that a lot. That people go, "Oh, I remember this," and I get it a lot on the streams as well. I get people just joining in and saying something like that. I remember this from back then. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if you've grabbed that before or something similar and given it a try. I mean, you could do it with the separate the MAME and MES binaries before, but I just liked having it all under one HUD, one configuration, one folder, one thing to work with. It made it easier for me to develop. And I think we've seen that now with the developments going on at the moment. A lot of people are developing it. They've got their test cases all in one place, and it works. So I'm glad eventually that decision was taken to do that officially. And like you say, with the arcade cabinet, you had things like the Atari 2600 games work perfectly. I mean, you can put Enduro next to Pole Position, and they're both really enjoyable racing games.
Absolutely.
I mean, you might not quite have the control set up for both of them, but I've played Pole Position on joystick before, and I've played an Enduro on joystick before, and they're both playable.
Yeah,
more so than some of the other games. But you try and play some of the later Namco races on joystick, and it's like, no, you really need a wheel for that. But some of the early ones,
true.
They play pretty well.
How old were you when you started working on the project?
Old? I mean, I'm 40 now.
Same here, yeah.
So let's rewind a bit. Say it.
So you're like 18, 17.
Yeah,
18
about
then,
that.
Huh?
I mean, it was when I was going through a pretty rough period at school, really, and I hadn't got the grades I wanted, and things weren't great. So it was a bit of a getaway for me to research all these things. So it would have been around that time, 17, 18, just trying to find something that meant something to me and that I could actually contribute something meaningful to. And so yeah, it was start about then. I mean, I was talking to Attila from RetroGames.com, which was one of the sites I used back in the day. And there's still a few of the old files up there from things I put out. I know before I was actually doing proper development, I was just hacking the code up in various ways. There's a build where I added eagle filters to MAME, the early smoothing graphics, which everybody hated at the time because it
Still do.
Yeah, I mean, then it became really popular. It's like, no, I hate this. Why do people do this?
It's great for 3D graphics, like N64, PlayStation 1 3D stuff, but yeah, not for my favorite arcade games.
No, I like the proper CRT filters that they've got these days. They kind of actually replicate more of the look you've got without, destroying every star on the screen because it tries to smooth it out to nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just one of those things. And so I did an LCD filter thing that tried to blur the screen just with a bit of a novelty. And then I, started looking at actual emulation. I think I started with some bootlegs, things like the Snow Brothers bootleg, the Winter Bobble, which was also in Rain. So I had a reference of it running, but no source code. Just little things like that. And it kind of progressed from there.
So when you say that, like I guess I have so many questions. I'm having a hard time filtering what I want to fall on my stupid face here. So when you first started this project at a young age, way before a lot of the tools that are available today, how would you start adding an arcade board to MAME back in the day, back in the late 90s like that?
Well, there were a lot of sites around at the time that had unemulated ROM dumps on. I mean, some of them were good dumps, some of them were bad dumps. And so you'd pull those files. They'd often have a README information in them with the list of the basic components on the PCB. Like this had a 68,000 processor, this had a Z80 processor, and then you'd have existing emulators that maybe did things that MAME didn't do yet. Say Rain was one of them. I know I ended up emulating WrestleFest in MAME, which ran in Rain for a long time. So I had an idea that the ROMs were good there and a reference to try and get it working even without the source code. But I mean, a lot of it back then was, for me, was looking at what was already in MAME. There's a game that uses a 68K, and looking at that drive and go, okay, I'm not an expert on 68K assembly at the time. I didn't know all that much about Z80 or anything else, but I'd take that drive, I'd see what that did. I'd swap the ROMs for the ROMs from the other game. I'd try and work out how they load. Try and change the program ROMs for maybe what looked like they were probably the program ROMs in the new ROM set, and sort of evolve that drive into something new. So I'd erase everything to do with the video code in the driver, comment it all out, and then just look at the accesses it was making instead of the original thing, and kind of work from there. I mean, back in the early ones, I didn't always know what I was doing. There were quite often people had to step in and go, okay, not quite right. I see what you've done wrong here, and then improve that. I think one of the earlier cases of that was UPL's Ninja Kid. I think Ninja Kun something. I don't think there was an English release of it, but I'd try my best to get that one running. I know it was a Z80 based one with multiple Z80s, but I didn't know that much about the communication. But I'd put something that together that displayed the title screen, kind of ran the demo, and then crashed. The whole CPU communication was wrong, and somebody else who was part of the team at that time, I think it was one of the Phils, I can't remember which Phil, stepped in and finished it off, and then I'd study how it had been improved, and I'd learn from that for future experience of next time I'm looking at a game, I have to consider that. I have to consider maybe how this shared memory works, how this syncing up the CPUs in MAME works. And at the time there were a lot of idiosyncrasies in MAME. Things you had to do a specific way because of MAME rather than because of what you're emulating. The way memory mapped to CPUs was a bit difficult and didn't always make sense. These days, it's a lot easier. Things are just logical. At a slight performance cost of, trying to squeeze every 8-bit game into a linear memory space rather than going through handlers to access all the ROM and everything else. There's changes. It was probably more difficult back then to work on certain things than others. And maybe today it's more difficult to work on them other things than it was back then, because these days the code base is a lot more advanced in terms of the language features, C++ features, things you might not know off the top of your head. Some of it's kind of obfuscated just by the nature of the knowledge of the language required. But back then it was simpler code, but more annoying in other ways because, we were dealing with much weaker processors at the time and had to make sure things ran faster because, if you're running on a 400 megahertz K62, which I think was one of the systems I had early on, it's not got that much performance behind it compared to the machines we have today.
Yeah, I think in '99 the average computer, at least in the US around where I was like a 486. That's pretty much it. Maybe a Pentium, maybe, but at that time your average house had, average computer house had a 486.
Yeah, I know my first PC was a Windows 95 machine, and that was a Pentium 100. And I think I moved on to some 200 megahertz AMD from there, then a 400 megahertz. And it was around that 200, 400 megahertz period of PCs that I was starting to get into MAME. And the fact that you could write a very simple bit of code to improve a bit of emulation, and suddenly your frame rate would nosedive.
Yeah.
You're having to consider all these things back then that these days you can write nice, clean code and take for granted. So the challenges have changed over the years. That is for sure. Anyway, that's about.
It's funny that you said maybe not funny, but it's interesting to me that you said that the way that you learned how to do this is by jumping in and doing it. And then kind of, once you're inside, figuring out what's going on while you're in there, because that's exactly how I learned. And as I've talked about that on the podcast, to be honest, I thought I was really freaking weird. Because I know so many people that would, they read a book on something, and then now they've learned it, and then they go do it. And I'm the opposite. I could read that book 50 times, and I barely retain. But the moment I do something, especially the moment I screw something up, that's when I really learn. I'm not a programmer, by the way. I don't know why I've tried. I can't wrap my head around stuff like that. But everything else is pretty much, I've done IT forever and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of games these days are done more by artists than programmers. They know a bit of Flash script rather than programming, and they've evolved from there. They know the graphics, and they can use the programs that just put everything together for them. So it's an evolving industry in that sense. But a lot of it is just diving in and throwing something together and seeing if it works or not. I mean, even today, not today, but say a couple of days ago, I was looking at one of these. In fact, it's this one I've got right here. I was looking at the emulation of this rather awful handheld. And I'd done some work on it in MAME a year or two ago, and there was no sound. And I didn't think I'd be able to get the sound emulation working because sound emulation isn't really my area. But I just thought, well, here's the code. I'll have a look at something else. There's some preliminary attempts to show me where the sound right should go, and I'll just hook something up. And I ended up with some sound coming out of the emulation. Now it's not perfect. I think it will need somebody else to look at that and maybe knows a bit better. But if that gets merged, there is now preliminary sound emulation in that one, just because I jumped in and did a task that I didn't necessarily think was going to go anywhere. And that's not changed that much. And it is a good way to learn, good way to understand things. And this is where most of my knowledge and understanding of MAME has really come from. It's self-taught. And I think that's a valid field. I mean, I've done industry work on games and stuff like that. And as much as your qualifications matter for some of them, they will also look at your portfolio, what you've done, how self-motivated you are to work these things out. And it's not just reading the books. It's trying things out. It's seeing what works. It's seeing what doesn't. And like you say, mistakes. Before I had PC, I had 8-bit micros. I had Spectrum, and I had Amstrad CPC. And I think I've said this. I might say this in the other podcast I did recently, but I learnt what formatting a disk meant the hard way.
Me too. I was like 5 years old, and my dad had a Tandy 1000. I don't know if you guys got those over there, but he taught me the directory command, and I'm looking at everything with an exe, and I'm like, "Oh, format. That sounds like a neat game." And then disk is gone. So
yeah, exactly. I remember the exact game that was on that disk too. It was a copy of One Man and His Droid, which isn't a great game, but it's one of those games that since I lost, once I got into emulation and found the Spectrum and Amstrad emulators, I wanted to try again because I knew that I had that disk as a kid and formatted it. In the end, I realised no big loss. It's just a game. It's quite an interesting game, but it's not especially fun. It's one of those that's like nice concept, bad game.
Yeah.
I need to do some sort of stream about those at some point. I'm going to do a Spectrum stream at some point too, but that one isn't on there because not all the games are easy to stream either. It's one thing you find with these games, especially the bad ones. It's like, well, how do I explain what's going on when I barely understood what's going on myself?
That's funny.
But yeah,
You just triggered a memory there for me. My dad bought a software called Copyright, RITE, and it was basically just a disk copy software that got around any kind of copy protection. And I remember when he came home, he wasn't the slightest bit mad because I had formatted a copy of something, because he was smart enough to know I got a nosy little kid who wants to play with a computer. So he all the disks that I had access to were copies of the stuff he actually bought.
Gave you a little sandbox to play in. The sort of automatically cracked versions of the games, not the originals. And
yeah, I guess I've been a dirty pirate since a kid, but this was software my dad bought, so it wasn't like he was stealing it. So it's kind of funny.
But you kind of learn things from that too. You learn about the copy protection. You learn things that you can't copy, that don't work, and you might have given you a copy of a game that had a copy protection message like after a few levels, and it starts to trigger thoughts of, oh, so this is a copy, this isn't the real game. And then you kind of learn from there. You get curious about things.
And as a kid, the first thing you do is figure out how to get around that copy protection, because if you're 10, 11 years old, your brain doesn't grasp consequences yet. You don't see the money you're taking out of a dev's pocket. You're 11 years old, and you go, let's see what I can do next. So
no, I remember back on the Amiga, which I also had, there was one, I can't remember which game it was, but it had a manual copy protection sequence, and at the time I didn't know 68K assembly or anything else. But I could open the disk image in a disk editor, and I saw all the words that were in the manual, and I just blanked them out. And then when I tried to load the copy, I just entered nothing, and it loaded. It was primitive, but it was still a kind of learning experience.
That's awesome.
Without learning the assembly. And it's just one of those little things you do when you're younger. Say that probably about 11, 12 at the time, something like that.
Modern Vintage Gamer has a bunch of videos, and he gave a great live talk about cracking encryption as a kid and growing up, and all the different encryptions he's figured out ways to get around, and stuff like that.
It's what we do a lot with the MAME stuff as well. There's so many protections we have to deal with. And I've talked about the decapping stuff earlier, but before we could actually get the code from inside the chips, we had to study the behavior of them and basically write simulations of them and all sorts of stuff like that. So there's a lot of that.
So how does that work? How does that work? Especially, whether you want to talk about how you do that today or back then, doesn't really matter. How would you go about doing something like that without the decapping process?
Well, it depends how the protection is integrated into the game.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of arcade boards will use an MCU of some sort, maybe a 68705, and they'll have a fairly standard communication protocol. They'll write a command to the device, they'll expect some data back.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if they write a command to a device and then expecting a very specific value back, you'll study the original code and just return that value on the reads. And for some games, that's all they need. There are literally some games that will check one value on startup and then happily run the game because they've put absolutely minimum effort into doing the protection. It's just a case of if the chip's not there, it doesn't run. I think Capcom's Black Tiger might be one of those. There's a few like that. But there are other ones where you start to see more commands being sent, more responses wanted. You realize it's performing some kind of descramble operation on the value that's written, and you have to kind of look at the data that's being written, look at the data that's expected back, work out what sense that means, what makes, what the formula might be, what it's using the data it reads it back for. Some games will write a level counter in one format and expect it to be read back in another format, or the write a value and expect the address in the game ROM where a power data is stored or something like that. So again, you have to start looking at these things, building up tables, analyzing them, and sometimes you'll have to run tests on the real hardware. I mean, the PGM game Puzzly 2, for example, is one that I spent a lot of time getting to work, and we know it's an ARM-based processor as the sub-processor, the sub-CPU, the protection CPU, but none of the commands in that in any way expose the internal ARM code. So we couldn't extract the code, so I had to study what the commands did, and they basically do things like decompressing the level data. So it'll start writing run length encoded sequences to the protection device and wanting to read decompressed level data back for the level structure. And to work that one out, I was working with somebody who had the board, had the cartridge, and was running any modified version of the program code that I wrote on the board. And it was just printing numbers all over the screen. So every single protection write, I would log on the screen as a number on the text layer, and then every response would just come back as another set of rows of text. And then I just compare, what the chip was sending back with what was written, try and work out the formula from there. And that mostly works. There's a few still in that driver. There's still a few hard-coded values for, I think, the music address location in the ROM, which is sending a number and getting a descrambled number of sorts back. But I couldn't work out the actual formula there, so we've just got the values that the program requires in the simulation. But yeah, there's all sorts like that. The more complex the protection, obviously, the more complex the routine is. Some calculate player movement angles, some calculate collisions. There's loads of them, and there's still plenty in MAME that haven't been fully figured out yet. I did a Cebu stream recently. One of the things that always gets us about Cebu is the cop protection, which is used on Cebu Soccer. And that is really complex. It's kind of been figured out enough to run Raiden 2, Legionnaire, and a few of the others, but Cebu Cup Soccer is using it in a far more advanced way than any of those. It's uploading slightly different sequences, and that's like the protection is running mini programs that the game code provides in a completely custom language, little snippets. I call them macro functions, because that's kind of what they are. And they handle collisions, movement, radar, graphics, whitelist sorting, all sorts of things. And it's just incredibly complex. And that's not even an MCU, that's some sort of custom programmed FPGA type chip from back in the day. And yeah, some of them are difficult.
Yeah.
I'm just glad that for a lot of them these days we've got the code and we can actually run them as CPUs. Tighter ones especially. I was replacing the Rainbow Islands protection simulation, which was an incredibly complex one. Looking at the code for that, you can tell the person who studied that one, but that wasn't me in the first place. Really, really loved Rainbow Islands and pulled the whole game apart and understood exactly what the protection was doing and everything else. And it was a detailed thing of that. This provides the enemy locations, everything for this level. This provides the platform data. This provides this. Even then, though, after all that, there was like a mystery on the random number generation for the objects at the end of a level for the goal. So when it throws out the bonus items at the end of the level, that's a random number generator, and they could not figure out the algorithm for that. So even then, with an extensive simulation that somebody had done, having the decap chip, the original code, just meant that it was improved that just that little bit more. But now it's running the original code. It's got the original random number generation sequence in there that's now running in MAME. And, you admire what somebody's done before, because I know how much work it would have been to create that protection simulation. But at the same time, it's glad to be able to just throw that out the project and replace it with the proper emulation of the chip now the chip is dumped. But it's a long process, and that's just some of the more simple cases. There are other cases with protection where you've got entire significant piece of the game logic hidden in the device, and they're much more difficult to deal with. CPUs with internal ROMs running parts of the game code. And sometimes,
it's funny, the cat and mouse game that we all have to go through to get this done, right? Because when these games were manufactured, putting this copy protection in and getting all this stuff right was so important, because you don't want, especially back in the day, right? If somebody with a bigger warehouse than you clones your board and sells 10,000 and you only sold 1,000, it was way harder to try to put a stop to any of that. But if you want this game to live on, now another set of people have to reverse engineer it. And it's not as easy as the original devs just going, here's the code, because there's still, who owns the IP? Like, are you really going to get sued because you gave the code of a 35-year-old game out to the internet? Like, no one wants to take that risk. So it's a necessary cat and mouse game to go through all that. And I know a lot of people like to use the P word, preservation, as a buzzword these days to bump up themselves in the algorithm or something, but it's really important. There are a group of people that have always been out there to want to make sure, like, let's take the steps. Let's just get it working. Let's get the game working. Let's have a way to play it, and then let's go back and try to make it as accurate to the original as possible, both for fun factor and just because, you don't want to. At the end of the day, if you had a choice, you wouldn't want a snapshot. Like, you wouldn't want a blurry picture of you to be how you're remembered, right? You want the real picture of you. So it's the same thing with the game,
Yeah, I mean, games are an interactive media. That's why I don't really like the whole streaming service, because, if a game is on a streaming service, nobody apart from the streaming service has got the code. And that is really bad. That's really risky. There's a good chance things like that being lost, because you don't want that snapshot. You don't want that blurry picture. You want to be able to preserve the original game. And that's what we've been doing over the years. That's what a lot of people have been doing over the years. I mean, I really admire the work that's being done in the Apple II scene. When you got 4AM and the like, preserving all the original copy protections, all this educational software that nobody really cares about as software anymore, because most of what it's teaching isn't even relevant anymore. But just preserving, keeping it, making sure it's done properly. A lot of this stuff is heavily protected and probably never left the schools it was sold to.
Yeah, but the efforts to go into that always lead to other stuff, right? Like, the Doomsday Duplicator project. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but the Laserdisc stuff.
Domesday.
Yeah, Domesday. Sorry. When that project first started, it was really focused in preserving one thing, and then it very quickly blew up to preserving all Laserdiscs, and now it's going on to VHS tapes and other stuff, and it's like, it seems so insignificant in the moment until years go by and you realize what it's been extended to.
Yeah.
Just like the MD Fourier project that Artemio started, for the Sega Genesis stuff. That's already been ported over to other consoles, and that's also being used to test audio equipment, to make sure people's recordings are good as well. So, it's people often don't understand how important it is, and in the moment, and that's fine. That's a very nerdy thing to have to understand. If you're not part of this, I wouldn't expect you to, but us fellow nerds need to, always remind people, just because it might not seem awesome in the moment, it's always going to lead to better things eventually.
Yeah, that again, you can say that about the whole of the MAME project. I mean, started off as an arcade emulator. Now we've sort of got industry standard component source code to emulate CPUs and everything else, which has, uses far outside of anything even we're doing. And it's, these days, because of the project relicensing from a few years ago, it's all under GPL or BSD, which means companies can use it, everything else. And you've got all these components that can be used for more than just gaming. They can be, integrated anywhere people want, as long as they're following the license, which are now clearly defined. And, I mean, I think that's going to be important in the future as well. You already see in like Windows, there's emulation components for old sound, Sound Blaster, MIDI emulation, all this stuff. It's not just playing games emulation. There's so much more to it, and making sure there's a good library of component emulations is just as important as the emulator itself. And again, you don't think of that when you start it. Nicola, I'm sure, didn't think we're going to have all these components, this library of components that can be used for even research for data recovery far outside of MAME. There are companies out there that need to recover data from old systems. They're now using emulators to work out how to program these systems to recover the data, because there's nothing else out there. It's create things that can interact with this old hardware without the original systems being there to interact with the old hardware. And then you've got the FPGA, the Mister scene building on top of what we've done. A lot of while that's quite a different area of research. Most of the devs that have done work for that type of thing would be going, without MAME pointing in the right direction, we wouldn't be able to do that. And that's now creating another field of its own in terms of, this clone hardware type thing that's going on. And everything leads to something else, which I guess is what you were saying. And you don't always understand where it's going to lead at the start. You just get on with it, and sometimes these things happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I gotta try to make a better effort to talk about the other aspects of MAME whenever I discuss it, because for me personally, like, because of what I do in RetroRGB, like, if I really want to mess with the Super Nintendo, I have 4 of them right there I could choose from. So I'm not going to use MAME to emulate something that I have. But
MAME Super Nintendo this isn't the best anyway. But
right, but in arcade board, like, even my friends with large arcade collections don't have 3,000 arcade ports.
No.
Like, there's so much you could do with the arcade stuff. So I got to make an effort to make sure I'm not diminishing the other work, because it is super important. I just personally get so excited about the arcade side of things.
Yeah, I know, a lot of people do, and that's understandable. There's things in MAME that I look at. One of my favorite games in MAME is the prototype version of Moon War. And to date, I think we've found one half of that PCB in America, and I think it was somewhere like Australia, the other half of that PCB. The soundboard was dumped, a good 4 or 5 years before the actual main game board. And clearly at one point that unit was together. I don't think there's probably only a handful of copies, and clearly they'd been split at some point. So yeah, your arcade's not going to have that. And
it's certainly not.
It's a fascinating little game. I mean, it's built on the Berserk Frenzy hardware, so it's got all the speech, your classic speech from Berserk and Frenzy, slightly different clips. And it's not a vector game, it's presented in a vector style. It's a simple addictive shooter, and it's like, this is far better than the actual version they released, because Stern reworked it and issued what was known as Moon War, which says on the PCB Moon War 2, which was just a very generic raster game with a background, everything else. Clearly they thought the old style Berserk graphics were too dated or something like that and didn't release it. The old version. But yeah, if you've got an arcade, you're probably never going to have seen that. I mean, I consider it pretty much a miracle that both parts of that got dumped and emulated, and we've got the game and the speech, because for a long time we just had, what are these Berserk speech ROMs that don't fit Berserk, and then the main board turned up. So yeah, there's all that. I mean, outside of arcades though, so I've been doing a lot of the plug and play work for the things like the Jet specific units. They're always based on the Sun Plus technology, and a lot of them is a really difficult dump, which is why we've not done all of them. But I did have one of the developers for one of the games come up to me and go, "Okay, we developed this game that was never released. Do you want to support it?" And it's like, okay, so we've got a completely unreleased unit now that again is just as rare as any of the arcade boards supporting MAME, and it's based on a popular IP. It's based on some of the DreamWorks stuff. So people who like the DreamWorks movies might find it interesting to look at these games that were never released, that there was literally not a single shred of information about on the internet until this guy came forward and goes, can you support this? Because it was cancelled. So
that's awesome. I love to hear stories like that.
There's all sorts of interesting little bits within the arcade stuff, outside of the arcade stuff. And it kind of makes it feel worthwhile. I mean, you're emulating all these really bad units, and then somebody comes along and goes, "There's some unreleased material," and it just makes it feel like you're doing something that matters to somebody, even if it matters to like 5 people. Something they worked on is now out there, which is.
Yeah, you just described half my videos, man. I did one project was like 100 hours worth of work, and I think the video got like 1,500 views. And I guarantee half of those people were like, "Wow, this is exactly the solution to the problem," and everybody else was like, "Why the hell am I watching this?" So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, if it's important to you, then it's important to other people. What do you think is a platform that you've worked on, or the thing that you've worked on? It doesn't have to be one, but what is something that really stands out to you as something you're really proud of that you worked on for the project?
That is a big question.
It is. That's why I said you don't have to pick your favorite, just one that pops up into your head.
If I think about systems I've enjoyed working on the emulation of, I think the Psychio SH based platforms that run like Strikers 1945 2, Gunbird 2 and the like, that was a fun one because I mean all the little effects it does, all the unusual blending modes it has and things like that. And also, it's got some good shooters on that I enjoy. I think that the PGM emulation was a big time investment, especially dealing with some of the protections, like I said, the Puzzle 2 stuff. And Kaneko's Supernova, which has the likes of Kyven on some of the later Gauss Panic games. I think if there's three that come to mind of systems where I genuinely like the games on them and found them interesting to work on, those would be up there. And I mean, some of that's, pardon me, some of that's down to the hardware itself. I mean, the Supernova I mentioned has got a kind of interesting RLE sprite system where it would decompress the graphics. PGM's, again, sprite system is kind of interesting. It's all packed into two separate sets of ROMs for the shapes and the color data and things like that. And as I say, the Psycho one has got all the blending effects. So if you look at the clouds on the first level of Strikers 1945 2, but it's randomized, but there's a level of all the clouds. And it's very rare to see hardware that has varying degrees of transparency as an effect. As standalone games go, with like one game on the hardware, the Sega Cool Riders, that's another one with its own unique compression scheme on the graphics, and trying to get that all optimized so it ran quickly was a challenge. And then these days, if I look at the code I wrote for that, it's kind of maybe I should clean the code up so maybe it's not so fast, but it's more readable, because I was having to write code to cache the decompressed sprites just for the speed on the machine I was using at the time, which I think was a Core 2 Duo, and obviously now Core 2 Duo is a good 10 plus years old.
15 now, yeah, actually.
Probably closer to 15. They're pretty old.
I used to work on when I designed, helped. I was on a team that designed computers. Sometimes I accidentally feel like I'm stealing credits. Not intentional. I was on a team that did. And those were the processors that we were switching over to, the mobile versions. And that's what I ended up installing in my Mortal Kombat machine, because I had all these prototype boards that, were junk, but you couldn't sell them. So I ended up wiring it up. And I was actually really impressed with the speed of MAME on a Core 2 Duo. It only had like...
Yeah, at the time, they were really good processors. I had a few machines based on the Core 2 stuff, and it's obsolete now. But compared to, say, the old processors worked on, it gave you some space. I mean, I think I was optimizing Cool Riders and the Cave CV1000 emulation for that processor. So I was always trying to find ways to do a bit of threading, because MAME doesn't use that much threading. It does the 3D drivers and the netlist audio stuff. But in general, a lot of emulation depends on the single core performance, not the number of cores. But I was trying to find ways to utilize that. So, yeah, it just gave me enough to get those to full speed on that machine. I mean, I'm glad I don't have to jump through those hoops now again. And again, looking at some of that code, it's like that's probably some of the ugliest code in MAME just to get the speed there. But again, they were fun challenges, though. The emulation, trying to optimize that cave driver, because Luca wrote it in the first place, but he sent it, and it ran about 25-30% speed on the machine I had, which wasn't much fun. It's like, this is too slow.
Yeah.
So it's like find idle skipping, find ways to make the compiler generate the most efficient code paths for the the video blitter and things like that. And that was a fun one. So I can't take too much credit for that, because it was working with somebody else's code and optimizing it. And there's still a lot to do. I don't like to talk about that one too much, because one of the big things with that cave hardware is the the blitter timing, the slowdowns, because the games run as if the machine had sort of infinite fill rate, which means the bullets are flying like this all over the screen, and you can't really dodge them too easily. But that's something for the future, and trying to work out exactly how that's all calculated without just relying on hex.
some of those games are impossible. Like I have no idea what they expected you to do in the arcade. Did they just expect you to show up with $10 worth of quarters, or like I just
But then
great
you watch
games,
the
but
single credit replays on YouTube, and you realize people have learnt how to play them. They're fairer than a lot of the older games that had collision boxes that were outside of your ship. I mean,
right.
say the key with those things is really the collision boxes are basically 2 or 3 pixels in the middle, and so the bullets are like 2 or 3 pixels in the middle. So if you sort of look beyond the flashy visual graphics and try and think where are the collision boxes, it's not as tricky as some of the older games to play them. But it is when they're moving far too quickly,
Yeah.
because the designers knew that if they put that many bullets on the screen, the game would slow down. And when it doesn't in MAME, it's like, yep, we just up the difficulty 10 times.
So that brings up a really good point in that for years, I mean, I've been, when I was 13 or something, I started a website talking about all of the new emulators that are out for computers, which is funny because it's like the same shit I do with RetroRGB, but as a little kid. But all of it was chasing a computer fast enough to be able to emulate it properly. And all of these brilliant devs were finding different ways to get them up to speed by sacrificing a little bit here and there. But we're at the point now where, the example you just gave of the original hardware has slowed down, which makes the game playable. And now you have emulation that's so fast that it's too fast. So whereabout are we at with CPUs? And I guess Raspberry Pi 4, because I like that just because it's a very easy solution for people. I think the test that Dan did with the RPi 4 said that they were actually able to play most games at full speed.
Yeah, they don't do a too bad job of the current version of MAME. Some of the stuff like the netlist audio, which brings a modern system to its knees almost. I mean, I think some of those on about 400% speed on a 4 gigahertz PC and maybe dropped to about 200. They're difficult, but that's sort of analog circuit simulations. But otherwise, if you for a current version of MAME, a Pi 4 does do an acceptable job with the classics and all the current emulation and the improvements, so you get in the more accurate emulation, and you're not having to use the older versions that were full of these hacks that we had to do at the time because either we didn't know more or we had to somehow make them run at a reasonable rate. It's not ideal. I mean, it's still significantly slower than a PC. I think the PC still runs things about 10 times faster than the Pi 4. But
what kind of processor do you think would if somebody wanted to make a really good multicade system at their home, what CPU do you think would you recommend for that?
Well, I've got my fairly old now I think it's i7 490K 4 gigahertz i7, and I think that's about 7 years old now, and that is a good processor. So I think you can probably get something cheaper than I paid for that new, just as fast, if not faster, these days. And so you do want to be looking at a fast CPU, especially if you want to look beyond everything that MAME's doing. I mean, you've got the PlayStation 3 emulators now. There's a PlayStation 4 emulator just come out, and you might
totally understandable. But I definitely want to focus just on people that want to do an arcade machine. Not anything, not any modern consoles, basically.
Not anymore. It depends.
Before, or I guess PGM. I think games PGM and Neo Geo I think were made past the 2000s. But I think I mean.
I'd say Neo Geo is pretty lightweight to emulate because it's just throwing lots of sprites at the screen. I mean, say for everything I run, the CPU I've got, which is say 7-year-old CPU, does the job. And in general, we would recommend sort of an i5 around the 3 to 4 gigahertz mark as a fairly safe bet. Things like the discrete audio, the netlist audio, is quite demanding. So the lower clock speeds might not handle it. The fewer cores might not handle it too well. But it does sound really good. I mean, compared to, say, old samples, if you fire out something like Boxing Bulls or Tranquilizer Gun in MAME, they just sound... It's difficult to put my finger on it. They just sound so much better. It feels like a more dynamic sound, a more... There's more life to it, but you do need the hardware to do that. And again, it's one thing people will go, oh yeah, you can use a 15-year-old PC and run all the classics just fine, all the old games. But say some of these 80s games, some of these Sega's old soundboards, things that what was the game? Is it Astro Blaster? I think Astro Blaster, the one with the speech, that's using netlist audio, and that sort of manages about 200% speed on my PC because it's just that complex, emulating all the analog circuits. So yeah, that they are taking a bit out of the range of, say, a Raspberry Pi or something like that. And even things like the Mister project is really good. That just they've got really accurate emulation on those. But things like discrete sound circuits, again, are really not what that type of hardware is made for. That is good for digital circuits. PCs and technology these days in general is not meant to simulate analog circuits. Right. It's just that demanding. It's you buy commercial software to do the same job, simulate circuits, and it won't be running them in real time. I mean, even for you're talking about before about people having to push really hard to get performance on the systems around years ago. For the netlist audio and MAME, it's the same. We're having to. Well, and I say we. I'm not personally doing the netlist stuff. That is far beyond me. But the people doing it, they're having to, try and compartmentalize parts of the netlist audio, where really on the PCBs there might be some sort of leakage on the circuits between the different components that would change the sound slightly. There are so many compromises, even just to do what is being done.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends. It depends what your expectations are, what you want.
I think a realistic expectation for people is to be able to play a game where it's not severely impacting the overall experience. Yeah. So, like, if you in the MK machine, I would obviously switch between the original board and emulation. But sometimes when there was a whole bunch of people over that weren't serious gamers, I wouldn't switch back to the original. I would just load up the emulation version on a Core 2 Duo 2.2 with 2 gigs of RAM or something like that.
Yeah, I think that'll probably still do more common today.
Yeah, it was totally fine. There was, it wasn't, but we've all seen the situation where you either slow down, there's huge frame drops, huge frame per second drops, and crazy input latency, so you can't even finish your moves because there's just nothing's keeping up. So I think realistic is just being able to, for a casual user, to not really know the difference.
I do get that. That's why I say I think what we recommend at the moment, which is sort of say a Pi 4B would be sort of the base Pi 4B. I wouldn't go below a Pi 4B. I mean, the Pi 3s with any current version of MAME really do struggle. They don't run the classics properly. Anytime we've had to improve the emulation, which includes critical gameplay fixes, things like the Taito C chip emulations, which control your basic game logic. Operation Wolf wasn't spawning in proper bosses and cutscenes and things like that. These are important things to people who actually want to play the games properly.
Right.
If you're missing bosses, you're missing bonus rounds, you're missing things like that.
Yeah.
So Pi 3's too low.
So when the older builds that were ported to the Pi were the older builds of MAME that were designed to run on not as powerful hardware anyway, right?
Yeah.
So, sorry, to anybody listening, we're doing this over Discord, and Discord itself has a bit of a delay, and we're across the pond from each other. So my apologies for talking over you sometimes. But yeah, so for I totally lost where I was going there. Sorry, you go if you remember.
you was saying the older version. It's the older version that end up on the Pi in general, and for the older Pis, that is true. You're typically dealing with MAME versions from 2000, 2003. When if you think about it, in 2000, MAME was 3 years old. In 2003, MAME was 6 years old. We didn't know that much back then. And that is sort of represented in the state of the emulation those devices are running. The Pi 4 did up its game enough to be able to do a reasonable job with the newer ones. So you do benefit from, all that new knowledge, which is there. And then if you want to, say, get a decent mid-range i5 from sort of 7 years ago or so, you can benefit even more because you can run more of the games and you're not having to fall back to those older versions. Because even with the Pi 4, there are times when you will have to fall back to those older versions, just in case in cases where we've improved it a bit too much beyond what the Pi 4 can run, because I mean, realistically, the Pi 4 has still got performance. The performance of a PC from about 10, 15 years ago. It's not something you can realistically keep in mind whenever you're doing development. It's a case of.
And I don't think you should either. It's just my opinion, but I think you should proceed as you have been, and it's just how to get this as optimized, how to get this as accurate as possible, and the hardware is coming. So if it's not already here.
Yeah, the hardware is here. You can buy it for the PC, and hopefully for the the smaller these the single board computers, it will improve. I mean, hopefully the Pi 5 will be another step up from the Pi 4, Pi 6, whatever else. It'll all come. I mean, you look at some of the phones you can buy these days, and they're pretty powerful for the size they are. It will come. It's just we're not going to say, oh yeah, you dumped this MCU. We're not going to emulate it because it will take the performance requirements too high. We're going to try and improve it. Say with things like Mister is setting the bar high all the time. We're not going to suddenly not try and better MAME because people are still trying to run it on underpowered hardware. We're going to always try and improve things. Sometimes the Mister team, the people, not Mister, I don't say team, but the people doing the Mister things will come to us with new knowledge. Contra recently got fixed in MAME because the Mister team did some research on it. They found out on the 3D stages the barrels were not meant to always veer off to one side. There was a math chip we weren't emulating. That didn't really change the performance too much. But at the same time, everybody's working together. We're always trying to improve things, and their research aided our research. And so it's important to try and stay on top of things, but sometimes that does mean performance goes up. Performance requirements go up.
So just to stick with this for a second, video cards don't really matter for performance for MAME still, right? They don't. It's not like they're using the GPU hardware to enhance the performance output, right? Or has that changed?
The GPU in MAME is only really used for the CRT filters and the like at the moment. Okay. There's no emulation code being offloaded onto it. There might be in the future. It's just finding a good way of doing that. You want a way of doing that is always going to give the same results regardless of card, which historically is a problem with 3D accelerated things. I mean, if you look at, say, the Model 2 emulator, a lot of people are struggling to run that on newer cards, newer hardware, because newer cards behave in a slightly different way. And if you look at the source code for that, so the source code isn't public, but I've seen the source code for that, and it is full of little hacks just to make sure it works with the way the cards at the period render things. And obviously now that doesn't quite apply. And same with some of the recent PC-based arcades that are being hacked to run on PC. They were designed with a specific video card in mind, and if you're not running that card, they don't quite work properly. You get depth sorting issues, you get entire scenes not rendering. So if we're going to integrate hardware 3D support into MAME, we have to kind of consider that. We have to look at a way of almost treating it more like a processor. We offload actual tasks where we know what the result is going to be, and then we use that to, an extra core, an extra set of cores, doing things that video card's good at, rather than just trying to throw polygons at the screen, because that's always going to change over time. And the one thing we want MAME to be is always giving the same results regardless of the platform. Obviously frame rate is going to suffer, but the final output should be the same regardless of what you're running it on, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. I think that's the right way to do it. And what about RAM requirements at all? Like, what do you think is a good amount of RAM to have in a computer, just to make sure that there's no bottlenecks or anything?
I mean, there's not much in MAME that requires an extreme amount of RAM. I recently had this machine upgraded to 32 gig, but that was just for streaming. Before that was on 16 and never noticed any bottlenecks. And I'm pretty sure if you can run, a modern version of Windows comfortably, you can run MAME comfortably. I think the biggest allocation I knew of MAME, even in the past, was like a 2 gig bitmap for some game, and that was sort of a one-off case of it allocating a huge bitmap. I think that was Golfing Greats by Konami that has a huge tile map or something like that,
Oh
and
wow.
it's obviously the original PC doesn't have it, but trying to represent that amount of RAM, that size tile map for the whole course, and storing it as a cache bitmap required about 2 gig of memory, something like that. But that was sort of an exceptional case. It's say I wouldn't say RAM was a major factor with MAME. To be honest, if you can run Windows, you can probably run MAME without it being a problem.
Because this conversation sparked a thought in that, if you don't own a Raspberry Pi 4 and you want to get one, you want to get a decent case for it, and you want to get a power supply because you can't use a cheesy power supply, you have to use a decent one. You got to buy a micro SD card for it. You're looking at about $100, right?
Yeah.
You may be able to get it cheaper. It might be more expensive depending, but that's what you're about looking for. But you could find a lot of repurposed PCs that have, bare minimum specs for today, but that were really powerful, 10 years ago. So you can get a small form factor. So they're still way bigger than a Raspberry Pi, but, as big as a couple of hardcover books, with an i5 processor that's, maybe 3 gigahertz and 4 gigs of RAM for like $75. Or you could get old laptops with broken screens that have those specs that you could just rip the screen off, and don't just rip the screen off, my fellow nerds, do it right. But like, but you could have yourself a small portable thing. And I like the laptop idea because it's got the keyboard built in too. And you could very easily have yourself a dedicated MAME machine off of old hardware for less price you get more performance out of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the Pi is the cheap option, as you say. Especially, companies will be getting rid of these machines that they don't want anymore, and most of them haven't been pushed to their limits if they're just being used for word processing and the like. And many of them are of a very good MAME spec. I mean, you might want to shove a slightly older graphics card in there to get away from the integrated one if you want to run the filters or something like that. But yeah, so I think even though some of the i5, i7 generation built-in GPU will do some of that for you as long as you're not, pushing the resolutions too high. You're not running 4K or anything like that. They'll probably still do a job. Yes,
the only reason I ever got really excited about the Raspberry Pi stuff is because it was one set of hardware that people could concentrate their efforts on.
Yeah.
Because when I spent, I don't need to tell you, I'll tell the rest of the people listening that I'm not exaggerating when I say I've spent thousands and thousands of hours of my life messing with emulation from the 90s till now, an absurd amount. And it's always been, with the exception of 2 different scenarios, it's always been more time, configuration, setting up, dealing with bugs than actual gaming. Yeah. And that Mortal Kombat machine was the only one because I basically used a bunch of different pieces of stuff that was out there to make my own very basic interface for the purpose of, the more basic, the less to go wrong.
Yeah.
And the Raspberry Pi solutions, because there was a whole bunch of people, rather than one person putting 200 hours into something, everybody put some time into it. So I think that's, and I haven't had, since that MK machine, I haven't gone back to do a PC build of MAME, but a lot of people have told me there's tons of things that are focused now on general PC use with it. There's even the Linux boot ISOs that you could put on a flash drive where you could just boot from there, and you even use your existing PC that you use for everything else. Just stick this USB stick in and boot MAME from it. And I'm really looking forward to going back and trying those things again, because I think there was a period of time where it was just, I'd rather take the performance hit, but not spend a day getting something configured. And now I think it's swinging back around where I think both are good choices, but I'd probably want to mess with the PC again next.
I mean, I think there have been those Linux-based boot CDs for a while. A lot of them are targeting kind of low-spec PCs in the first place, so they're not always the ideal solution. I've not looked into them personally because it's not really something I do. I mean, I'm developing the project. I'm not looking for that type of solution, but I think they've been around for a while. But yeah, you say with the Pi. At the time, it was quite focused, but these days, you say you've got the original Pi, you've got the Pi 0, 2, 3, 4. That's kind of fragmented that market.
Yeah.
And a lot of those are still targeting the lowest hardware, which is the problem. You can get a Pi 4, and then you find all these images out there, which are really tailored more to an original Pi. or 3, or or even like the Pi Zero, and there's no reason to be running a 20-year-old main build on a Pi 4, but these especially the pre-built ones that people are putting out there, do that. I think to a point you still get that with the PC. I think with MAME, some of it, the time you put in is what you get out of it. I don't know if there are other solutions out there which use more modern versions for pre-built images, like you say, these boot CDs. I've not really studied it these days, but I think once you set it up, which might take a while, then a lot of the time you can just forget about it. You can put a week's worth into setting it all up, and then.
Well, I mean, the problem with those setup things wasn't the use. So once you, like, if you theoretically had a keyboard sitting next to you, and you give up your DOS prompt, and you manually enter it in, and you load your game. That's no setup. Like, you configure your buttons, you make sure that no button combo opens a menu or closes it, and you're done. The problem was, what happens when you want to switch games? What happens when you want to just do a soft reset? What happens if you want to have a party over and you don't want to take out a keyboard every time you have to select a game? You want people to select, and that's where the issue was. Getting MAME running in a scenario like that is quick and easy and reliable. Doing everything else isn't. So it was the skin, I guess.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. The front ends. I mean, that's a whole field of its own, front ends and things like that. I know things like Hyperspin were a massive amount of work to set up, and people were selling their Hyperspin projects because they'd put thousands of hours into getting this specific setup with all these graphics and all this and everything else. Yeah. And I mean, obviously these days MAME itself does have a more robust full screen interface. It's not perfect for the situation you described, though, because people can easily change the settings. But I don't know what the best front ends are these days, to be honest. The selection out there, I'd say it's not something that personally I encounter that much, because I am working from the command prompt. I don't look at the interface that much. If I'm developing something, I'll be changing the code, compiling it, hitting up on the keyboard to get the last thing I type back up on the screen, launching the game again, and seeing if the bug I'm trying to fix is fixed.
Yeah.
And I don't mind if I've got people over. I don't mind doing the whole admin work. So you want to play this game, I'll put this game up and everything else. But I can fully understand in, say, a party environment, that's not going to work. It's you can't do that.
That's an argument I always have with my dev friends, and that, like, if you're talking about when I'm working on something, I'm working on a project, I've been doing the command prompt since that was your only choice, right? But when you're talking about when it's time to stop developing and start messing around with it, like, I refuse. I want something. I want a GUI. I want something to click on. I want I want to feel like there's a difference. I don't want to feel like I'm still in dev mode. I want to feel like crack a beer, play Mortal Kombat mode. But it's just my preference. I'm not saying there's a right and wrong. No. It's just me personally. So
no, I get that. And with front end development, it's a big task on itself. I mean, you have to try and develop a front end that also supports the advanced features of an emulator. You get too many front ends that sort of don't let you use the emulator properly. They'll cut out features. They'll stop you doing things, and that's not always ideal if you want a front end that's going to let you launch, something else, maybe a non-arcade game with a different controller attached. All the odd configurations, and it's finding a balance. I mean, what I think Launchbox is still a pretty popular one these days, but I've never tried to use it. Again, it's something that needs its own research that I've not done. So I don't have a huge amount of input on.
I'll make that a priority to do a live stream and a video about, like, let's build a MAME dedicated MAME PC and see where we go from here, because that's something, now that I finally get out of a tiny apartment and into a real people-sized house, I want to get a sit-down arcade cab, and I want to have a MiSTer setup and a MAME PC setup. So I got to figure out the best way to go through that.
If you're doing a proper high-end MAME PC setup, I think things like the FreeSync and G-Sync monitors make a real difference too, because that's one of the big complaints we get is that things don't move smoothly because MAME tries to use the correct frame rates, the correct speeds, and everything else. And you typical monitors these days aren't like CRTs. They don't do that properly.
Yeah.
And so unless you're going to jump through hoops and hacks and everything else, you do need that for a good MAME setup, I will say. I mean, it's something I don't really even have here at the moment. But again, it doesn't really bother me too much because I'm doing development work.
Right.
I'm not bothered about more expensive monitor, but if you're doing that type of thing, I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny for me personally. The gaming is all going to be on CRTs, but everything I do, like I want to be able to do. I want to be able to take screenshots. I want to be able to do live streams, do videos. So even though my gaming is always CRTs, I still have to deal with the HDMI side of things just to make sure that all the digital stuff comes through looking okay. So yeah, it's pretty funny.
You've obviously got older systems like the Vectrex or Vector games where you can't do it on a CRT properly. If you want to do that properly, you would have to point a camera at the screen and or use the emulator because there's not much choice there. And then the emulator is never going to look the same as the Vector monitors. I've had people ask me quite often, how can I stream from a Vectrex? Or it's like, well. You can
a tripod and a zip tie, and then put your cell phone right there.
Pretty much. I mean, I do love those things. They look beautiful. Too. If you ever use one, I don't know if you've got one, but
I had one for a while. My cousin still loves his. He plays his all the time.
Yeah, they're lovely screens. I think we need the Vector technology to come back. That was good tech for the games it ran.
Yeah, but, there really is no way to emulate it. Because, I mean, I've seen CRT filters that if you didn't grow up with CRTs, you wouldn't know the difference, right? Yeah, no. But there's no way to emulate the way a Vectrex monitor or a Vector monitor looks, right? Even Tempest, right? No. Like a lot of those original games, you can't quite ever get the same thing.
Not being the same level of research into it either. I mean, you get the CRT filters that generally look okay, but the Vector filters, they're still very rough. I've tried using some on the stream. You either get too much bloom, not enough bloom. You lose the subtlety in the different brightnesses of the lines. You don't get the whole experience of a Star Wars cabinet where the Death Star is exploding and you're kind of backing off from the screen because you think the screen might explode because it's pushing the monitor that hard and flickering and the image is sort of warping and it's like, okay.
It's buzzing. You hear the buzz get louder as the screen gets brighter. Yeah, there's a whole experience part of that. So.
You don't get that. But let's say they do those Star Wars mini cabinets now, but I don't think they have a proper Vector monitor, do they? I think they're just a standard monitor these days.
The other thing is the chaos theory. I just watched Jurassic Park again the other day, but like how nothing is perfect on any type of CRT. So when you get the CRT emulation, it's a really perfect emulation. Like even when they do the old school where it's curved, it's still a little too perfect, right? It's all random on CRTs, and even more so with the Vector monitors, how it blooms out every direction that the beam is going in when it it's not. Yeah, it's hard to ever. I don't know if anybody could ever replicate that.
I mean, the whole thing with a lot of the CRT filters is a lot of them based on the NTSC tech as well. And obviously over here we had PAL rather than NTSC, so it's always going to look a bit different. But I remember trying to work with Deluxe Paint on the Amiga, and you'd fill the screen white and the image would expand. You'd fill the screen black and it'd contract. Or you could have half and half and your status bar would be like this. And, even the best CRT filters aren't doing that. I'm not sure you'd want that, but...
I wouldn't want that, but it's still part of the experience, right? Yeah. I was just right before I started this with you. I was doing shooting my weekly Q&A, and we were talking about like the randomness and just accepting the CRT for what it is. Like, don't obsess about perfect. I mean, I shouldn't say that. If you want to obsess about perfect geometry, go right ahead. But for me personally, it's like. Yeah, I'd get really annoyed if my 65-inch OLED had geometry that was all off. That would look stupid. It would bother me. It would ruin the experience. But it's kind of part of the experience on the CRT,
Yeah. And part of that, say the noise they made as well. Sometimes all these things, they're part of the past, though. I guess we do the best these days to make the graphics look pretty much right, because obviously if you've got big blocky pixels, that's not how a lot of these looked in the first place. So something to almost make the art look a bit more like it was designed. Obviously the NTSC stuff, some of the artifacting used in games there to create colors is an emulation field on its own, and then some of the accidental things. There's a bug report open for MAME with the Mega Drive and the NTSC filters, which is about zero tolerance, and the striped effect there on a proper CRT creates a rainbow effect. And apparently the rainbow effect isn't quite the same in MAME. The designers probably didn't intend that effect to be there at all. It's probably a case of this happened. But
I love things like that. I don't want to get too off topic here, but like when I'm in a band to play music and stuff, and when we were recording the album a couple of years ago, I'm talking to the guy who's mixing it, and I always have my OCD. I have my 3-page list of all the little things, like what's this, what's that, and we get to the last page, and I'm like, what's the sound at this part of this song? And he's like, what are you talking about? And he plays it back, and we listen. He goes, I don't hear it. I was like, it almost sounds like a cowbell, but not quite, and it almost sounds like the drummer hit the rim. But that's not, and we found out that it was just a weird artifact of two of the plugins that made a really neat, like you wouldn't know it was there unless like you were looking for it, but it kind of added a weird thing, and it was all a mistake. It was all just a weird thing. And so like that's part of the other thing about getting these game experiences more accurate to the original. Because you could say that was a mistake, and that there's a sound in one song of my album that shouldn't be there, but I love it, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so appreciative when people go back and try to tweak these older games, because it's the glitches, the bugs, the rainbow effect that you just talked about that probably wasn't supposed to be there anyway. It adds so much like unique charm to all of these experiences.
It's another reason why with MAME we like to make sure not just the most correct, most current version of any game gets preserved. We like the prototypes. We like the early revisions. The famous examples, obviously, things like Street Fighter 2, where the early versions had the sort of handcuff bugs and the reset bugs and all these things. And people remember them. People like them. Capcom, fixed the game eventually, took these things out. But people still want to be able to go back and see those old versions, those old bugs. And again, that's something you get with emulation. You lose that a lot with modern systems. Every time I turn the PlayStation on, it's like, this game needs an update. You must update this game, otherwise you can't connect online. You can't do this, you can't do that. So something can be taken out of game, and then you'll never see it again. I guess with arcades in the first place, if the arcade fixed the game, it'd be the same. But these days, at least with those, we can go back and people will find old boards and things like that. I don't know if there's any specific bugs, but last few days, a new Pengo set turned up, and it was found that it had the same encryption as the bootleg Pengo sets, rather than the typical Sega encryption on the other sets. And so it's very likely that that set that's just turned up is the earliest version of Pengo that all the bootleggers copied. Now, if there are any specific bugs or interesting things about that, I don't know. But again, I think even with modern developments on old systems, though, we lose that. I look at some of the new games on old systems like itch.io, and they only ever have the current version of the game on. If you want the older releases of the current software, you're going to have to ask around the community and hope somebody downloaded it. And so you can find the change this, fix this bug, change this, change that. If you want to see the older version before that was changed, before that was fixed, it's a bit of a problem, and that's a shame. I mean, something we've learnt over the years with MAME is like older versions of software is worth documenting. People have some sort of connection to the older version, some connection to that bug you mentioned, some connection to this, some connection to that. And again, I'm waffling on about scope of MAME and support and things like that, but even for older games with emulated, it's always interesting to find an early revision, a different revision, a change revision, something we weren't expecting. That happens all the time too. Even if you've played a game in MAME 1,000 times, there might be a new set that's been added in the last 5 years that's turned up that's equally interesting to have a look at.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so I don't think I got anything else to say on that subject. But yeah,
I thought it was an awesome answer, so whatever. So I like doing open forum topics like this because we've covered just random discussions about video games and some of your in-depth knowledge on MAME. I really like the variety of this, so people who super nerds could enjoy it, just general nerds like me could still enjoy it, even though I don't get all of what you're saying. I'm mostly following, but so I guess that's a perfect transition here. For people that want to get involved in MAME and want to play it on their own, I'll take care of that. I'll put up a new guide, MAME in 2021. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be here for.
I'm trying to do things like that too.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side of things, though, how do people if people want to get started helping or messing with it, or even if they don't, not maybe in an official capacity, but they say, I'm into programming, I want to try to add or fix or something, a game in MAME. How do they get started with that? What's the tools they download? Is it open in a way where anybody could just jump in and start messing with it and then maybe submit what they have if they're happy with it?
I get that. I mean, the whole tool chain is open. We try and make sure it can always be compiled with open source software and the like. If you go to the official MAME GitHub page, you can download the source, install a client. I mean, I use SourceTree, which isn't the best. It's a bit rough around the edges, but it works for me. You create an account there. You can download the source. You can study the source. You can make pull requests. Obviously, again, you're going to have to look up things. You're going to have to learn how the tools work, how the website works, how this works out, all that stuff, and practice with it a little bit. In terms of coding, I will always recommend studying what's there, which is what I've always done. If you've got an interest in the system, look at the driver that's there, try and understand how it works. There's not always that opportunity really recently to add simple, easy drivers, because most of what's easy to emulate, we've already emulated. So it's not like back in the day when I was finding random Korean games that use cloned hardware that I could add to existing drivers. But study what's there. Find original hardware references. They're far easier to find these days than back in the day. And a lot of the time, people will think a bug in a game is a bug in MAME, and it's not. That happens quite a lot too. So if you can find references to prove what you're doing is right and that you're not wasting your time trying to fix a bug that you're never going to fix because it's part of the game, because these games are buggy. A lot of these games have really silly bugs you might not expect them to have. For example, a lot of games, if you complete them, they won't give you the name entry screen because the developers, for some reason, run the end credits and forget to give you the name entry screen. That happens on so many games, and people have reported that as bugs before. But it's not. That's just how the game is. But yeah, all the tools are available. The official, MameDev.org site has a whole development tool section where you can download the package. You can update the package, the step-by-step instructions, how to download the package, how to download the source, and make sure you've got the account on GitHub if you actually want to contribute. Easy things to contribute. I mean, I've often said in other times, just things like the non-arcade software lists, just keeping up with what's being dumped, adding them, because we don't have eyes everywhere. People can be dumping new cartridges for systems, and they never submit them. They'll post on a forum somewhere. This prototype turned up. This prototype was dumped, and we might not see it. So if somebody opens a pull request to add that to the software list for the XML, so that MAME knows about it, that is a valid contribution. For more advanced things, pardon me. We do need people with a good knowledge of the systems to start becoming involved, because a lot of MAME work these days is external. A lot of the contributions are external. People with a really deep knowledge of a system who've done research on the system contributing to it. And that is really important because, the core team is pretty small. Even these days, I work externally to the core team mostly. So it's something to keep in mind, that don't take for granted that we're going to do something. Don't even take it for granted that just because we haven't done something, it's going to be ridiculously difficult. I fixed a bug in one of the Botanic clones yesterday, the day before, and that was actually really simple. The game had weird glitchy behavior, and it looks like a protection check in that. There's one of these fixed value ones, and that's probably been broken in MAME for 5-10 years, and I guess nobody looked at it. But there are always little things like that to look for and fix, even beyond the huge know the system inside out thing. You can look for little things like that. Same with Sega's Tranquilizer gun. It crashed after level 3. And again, that's just a few protection checks in the code, returning fixed values in different situations. There were probably a PAL on the PCB or something like that. And it was an easy fix, but I'm sat there scratching my head thinking, so we've been shipping MAME with this bug in for 15, 20 years. And it would have been really easy for somebody to sit down, look into that, pull up the disassembly, and fix it. It's not the most challenging bug to fix. I'm quite surprised. Again, it's one of these. I'm quite surprised I end up being the person that fixed that, because it's kind of trivial. But maybe just nobody cared about the game. Maybe people thought that's too difficult. I could never fix that. In the end, the fix was like 5 lines of code.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's not something I would have thought to say. That's a brilliant point, and that just because it's not fixed doesn't necessarily mean it's a really huge hurdle. So if you have some coding knowledge, jump in and see. You never know.
Yeah, there's always opportunities. Being self-motivated is probably the main one. Not being intimidated by a task and just trying something. So that's important. And if you've got those, those skills, that can take you a long way with it. The approval process can be quite tough, quite nitpicky these days, which even gets on my nerves, but it's just kind of the way the project is run. It's like, yes, this, that, everything else, this isn't quite up to scratch. You didn't name this quite right. And that can be off-putting. Even the times that's put me off, I will say, don't let that put you off too much. It's just kind of the current way the project tries to keep things tidy, keep things organized, keep things presentable, well maintained for the future. It's
yeah. Well, I can't speak for programmers. I could surely speak for being picky about stuff like that, because it's so easy for large scope projects to just suddenly you have no idea where anything is, where anything's labeled, and it's never. You never see it coming. It's just like, all right, well, we don't really need to worry about those labels. I'll come back next week, and then a year later, it's like, what the hell happened? I can't find anything. Yeah. So I at least understand that side of it, even not being a programmer. Yeah,
it's frustrating as a programmer, because sometimes you just want to be able to get on with something. Sometimes you burnt yourself out studying something. And you're right, this is done. I want this out of the way. I want to move on to something else. And then you come back and it's like, no, change this, change this, change this, change this, change this.
I thought I was done.
Yeah, I mean, MAME, because MAME evolved so rapidly over the years, there is a lot of code in MAME that has had to be revisited and improved in that way. A lot of the work being done over the last few years that's not, refining the emulation of things, is just going back and tidying things up. Because, again, we want to... This is our document. This is our encyclopedia of everything to present to the future generations. It does need to be presentable and respectable, even though that can be draining in itself. But again, I think I have seen and talked to people who have been really put off by that, and I can empathise with that. I can understand that. But sometimes you do have to jump through those hoops to contribute. And again, it might be easier to contribute to another project that doesn't, or contribute to an older fork of MAME where there are no standards. They're just throwing everything in they can to try and keep up with something, or give the impression they're doing something. And it is strict. And again, with MAME, you've got a case of you can't just apply a fix that fixes one thing without testing it elsewhere. Your fix has to be correct for maybe a whole bunch of other systems, 10, 15 systems using the same chip. It's very easy to look at the source code, maybe another emulator that only emulates one system, and go, oh, that does that this way, so that must be correct. But you get to MAME and you realise that there are 10 other systems using that chip, which disproves what the other emulator was doing. So while that other emulator might do a better job of one platform, it's actually doing it by doing things the wrong way. And again, that's something that people tend to have a problem understanding, because if you've got an emulator that's 100% compatibility for, say, the Spectrum or CPC, because the CPC and Spectrum only use the chip in a certain way, then why is that not acceptable to MAME? But then you've got all these other use cases that have to be considered. It's difficult, it's challenging, but don't be too put off with it. Just understand that in the end, all these other test cases are helping you develop better code, helping you to understand things better. It's
Good point.
It's just how it is these days. It's hard to promote in a positive way, but at the same time, the end result is a better emulation of this component rather than just a system-specific hack, which, it's a challenge.
It makes sense. Is there a central place for discussion? Is there like a MAME Discord server that people prefer? Is it just on the GitHub? Or?
There is a Discord server, but it's usually closed off. The invites go out every now and again. It's more sort of just where the developers gather. There are forums on mamedev.org, but they don't get used much. The banisters.org forums, which is listed in the MameDev site as support forums, do get used a bit more, although the registration process tends to be quite slow. I think the accounts are manually approved still because there was quite a lot of spam problems and things like that. So it's a bit awkward. So I think that's probably one of the better places to ask, though. You'll still get developers on, Main World, even though that isn't really a major site these days and is kind of a little bit dead. People post on, there are generally a few devs looking in different places, so you usually find somebody. I'm not really sure what to say.
No, that's sometimes a good answer.
Sometimes people will post things on my YouTube account. They'll go to I do my streams YouTube/MameHaze.
Perfect segue. That was going to be my final question: is where do people find you? And I've lurked on quite a few of your streams, by the way. I don't usually interact because I'm usually looking and listening while I'm doing 10 other things. But you do very interesting streams sometimes, where you go through sometimes good games, sometimes terrible games, sometimes everything in between.
I like to mix it up.
So your YouTube account again? Sorry, is.
YouTube/MameHaze, MameHaze, and same for Twitter and also Twitch, but I don't really use Twitch these days. It's sort of a backup option if YouTube just falls apart. I've got the account, I've got some affiliate status there or something like that if I need to use it, and then I would sort of it sits there, and I might do the occasional thing on there as a surprise, but obviously YouTube, I've got a much bigger following than over there, and it's kind of nice to have that audience interaction. If I stream on Twitch, sometimes it'd be like, hello world, I'm here. Maybe somebody can raid me. But on YouTube, I've had the YouTube channel for years. I've, uploaded. I've not really done the live streams until more recently, but I've uploaded various progress videos of things, new emulation things and the like. Tried to do a bit of promotion. I've kind of moved away from the whole website thing where I would do the... just write progress reports there, because people seem to want it in a video format these days, which makes sense. You see screenshots of things running videos of things running rather than screenshots. You can hear them, especially with sound improvements. You can hear the sounds better. I can't say, this is improved and screenshot, and you don't really get the idea on the website. Yeah. Although, I still do the yearly summaries. That's MameDev, MameDev.it/ no, sorry, I can't remember the URL. Let me just.
I'll make sure to have. I'll have everything in the description.
It's the site URL is MameDev, MameDev.emulab.it/haze. That's a much older site though. That's just the one I used to post all the updates. I still do upload some screenshots. I try and keep a sort of yearly log of things that I've done. So I've got a 2021 one open at the moment where there are currently a bunch of screenshots of what. Let me just have a quick look. We've got some of these Sharp Cookie educational emulated screenshots up there, some Dora things, a couple of UK fruit machines that have been improved, some TV board game plug and plays, things like the Mrs. Dynamite Universal Arcade game that showed up recently. There's a few screenshots of that. So I try and keep a bit of a log of screenshots so that people who did used to go to that site can still go there and still see progress visually, just in a single page where they can scroll through things. Sort of an evolution of the old MAME work in progress site that was online back in the day, which was always popular because people like to see what was going on and not just have a big text file that they can't digest, which isn't always ideal. But yeah, so yeah, if people want to catch up with me there, they can. I can give you the links if you want to put them in the description, something like that, because it's probably easier than people trying to understand every word I've said and accents and all that lot, because I don't want them to end up confused.
No, I'll make sure to have all the links in the description. And thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I both really appreciate the time, and I'm frustrated because I have about 9 million other questions I wanted to ask. But I feel like this is a good starting off point. Maybe we could do a live stream together in the future or something when I put together a dedicated MAME PC thing or something.
If you've got any more questions to ask, anything like that in the future, I'm always happy to find a slot and talk to people. And I'm sure you could find other developers as well who are willing to. I can try and ask around if you want, but I'd say I don't know specifically who would or who wouldn't. But I know there's other people out there who do talks, especially if you've got specific areas you want to cover and things like that. But yeah, it's been good, thank you. And I say I appreciate you inviting me on here, allowing me to talk about these things, and it's been nice having a good chat. It's something, because it's one thing I kind of really didn't do for a long time. I sort of shied away from the public view, just got on with things, put my site up. And I think these days it kind of makes more sense to sometimes just talk about what's being done, reflect on it, or
sometimes just start talking.
Yeah,
the conversation leads itself. Because this was great. You're good at this, so do more of them, definitely.
All right, thank you. You too. So I'd say I've got to catch up with some of your older ones as well. I've sort of looked at some of them, but I've never managed to sit down and watch them all in a big block or anything like that. But I should do
the one that you might want to listen to is with me and Dan Mons, because he renewed my interest in MAME, and because I'd never lost interest, but as new things come out, sometimes you only have enough hours in the day. And talking to him, that, and it was him trolling me to stop using a Raspberry Pi to use MAME was really what got me reinterested in it.
I'd say it's to say I look at your YouTube channel and I see all this hardware you've looked at, all this review of this and that, and it's like, well, with what I'm doing, I don't have time for all that stuff. So I can fully understand if you're not dedicated to doing MAME stuff. A lot of it's just going to pass you by, and you're going to come back in 5-10 years and go, "What's changed?" And
everything apparently.
Some way of, everything.
Awesome.
But yeah, so that makes it. Well, so thank you. It's been good, and I don't know how you want to end this or close this, but yeah, it's been good.
Just a good thank you. Thanks again, and I'll definitely be keeping in touch. So
right, take care. Look after yourself. Bye.